as 1965, there's very little protest against the war at home. But by the end of 1967, the protest against the war, and maybe more specifically the draft, had come to dominate national politics. There are massive peace marches in New York, D.C., and other large cities, and these draw lots of attention in the media. Journalists who had been in Vietnam began coming home and telling stories of how brutally we're treating these people and how pointless the war is. In January of 1966, Senator Fulbright, a Democrat from Arkansas, publicly turns on the war. He's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and so he has televised hearings about everything that's going wrong in the war, and there's quite a bit. Others in Congress begin to join him, and we begin to have kind of mainstream politicians questioning the war, if not outright condemning the war. In 1967, Bobby Kennedy joins him. Kennedy had been JFK's Attorney General. Now he's a Democratic senator from New York. Even Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, who had engineered the whole war, quietly resigns from the government in disgust in 1968 over the failure of the war. The new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, comes out and says we should begin to scale down the war. The Great Society in Vietnam and the Vietnam War led to massive government spending, and this begins to cause inflation. Inflation creeps up to 3% in 1967, 4% in 68, and 6% in 69. Budget watchdogs begin pointing to the growing budget deficit. And so in August of 1967, LBJ asked for a tax increase to try to keep inflation down and pay for some of this spending. Conservatives negotiate with him, and instead he takes a $6 billion cut in his Great Society programs to wage his war on poverty. We do not cut spending on the war in Vietnam. If you've never heard Masters of War, if you're in my class, we're going to listen to it. But if you've never heard it, Google it, take a minute, listen to it, look at the words. It goes along perfectly with what we're talking about right here. The civil rights movement and the Vietnam War will combine to make 1968 one of the most volatile years in American history. It begins in January 31st of 1968, when the North Vietnamese launch a massive attack on southern cities all across Vietnam. The city of Hue falls, but others are able to repel the attackers. When people turn on their TV, what they see is the Viet Cong in Saigon and the other cities bombing and killing government officials. They briefly seize the American embassy, and it shocks them. It appears we're losing the war. It appears it's spiraling out of control, and that brutality is right there in your living room. And it doesn't help that this image appears. This is maybe the iconic photograph of the war. This is a North Vietnamese officer shooting a Viet Cong prisoner in the head. Now, what people didn't realize, and maybe this matters, maybe it doesn't, is that the Viet Cong guy had killed the North Vietnamese officer's daughter. But still, this picture became kind of a symbol of everything people believed we were doing wrong in the war. The Tet Offensive in reality was quickly repelled, and it was a major defeat for the communists. They suffered enormous casualties, and they failed to hold a single city. It decimated the Viet Cong numerically in the south, and it forced the North Vietnamese army to do most of the work in the war going forward. But the problem is, in America, it made the constant assurance that the war was going well, that there was, quote, light at the end of the tunnel, it made it all look like a lie. It made it look like, no, we haven't almost won, it's only getting worse. It wasn't, but that's what it looked like on TV. It was a political disaster for the American government, and it really is going to bring down LBJ's administration. Once television turns against the war, though, then it's all over.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victor.
LBJ understood that when Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, turned against the war, it was all over. The public turns in the war as well. Public opposition doubles in just 3 weeks after the Tet Offensive. LBJ's personal likability falls to 35%. At the time, the only other president who had been more unliked than LBJ had been Truman. That record has since been broken by Bush.